Welcome to a deep dive into some fascinating topics. We're tackling slavery,
Oh, wow.
ethnicity, and economic success.
Okay.
You've given us quite the reading list this time.
Mm-hmm.
Excerpts from some pretty dense academic studies,
Right.
a history of the word redneck from Huber's book,
Uh-huh.
and even some YouTube lectures by the economist Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
From your notes, it looks like you're trying to get to the bottom of what really drives success for people
Right.
and entire groups, especially those who've been historically disadvantaged.
Yeah.
Is it just about government policies leveling the playing field,
Uh-huh.
or are there deeper cultural forces at play?
That's a really layered question, and certainly not one with any easy answers.
Yeah.
What I find so intriguing here is how often we run into these really simplistic explanations for such complex issues.
Yeah,
It's easy to get swept up in those narratives and miss the nuances. I think this deep dive is going to be like piecing together a puzzle.
Okay.
We'll look at all these seemingly disparate pieces of information
Right.
and see if we can assemble them into a clearer picture.
I love that analogy.
Okay, good.
So, to start piecing this puzzle together,
Mm-hmm.
let's dive into a topic that's often framed in very black and white terms. Slavery.
Okay.
Sowell argues, and this is really compelling, that slavery wasn't always about race.
Mm-hmm.
He points to centuries of Europeans being enslaved,
Right.
not by people from, distant lands,
Mm-hmm.
but by other Europeans.
Interesting.
To really understand that point,
Okay.
let's look at the history of the Slavs in East Central Europe.
Right.
You include some material on that,
Yeah.
and it really shows how they experienced various forms of subjugation, including serfdom and just outright enslavement.
Yeah.
And what's even more interesting
Mm-hmm.
is this wasn't just at the hands of foreign powers.
Wow.
Their own nobles were often involved in this system of oppression.
That is,
It makes you think.
yeah, it really makes you think about the assumptions we bring to
Right.
these historical narratives.
And while we're on the topic of assumptions, get this.
Yeah.
The Dalmatian coast,
Mm-hmm.
a place most of us probably associate with like stunning beaches,
Right.
was a major slave trading hub.
Oh, wow.
Way before the transatlantic slave trade.
Really?
We're talking centuries earlier. They were supplying slaves to all corners of the Mediterranean.
Wow.
Spain, Germany, Egypt,
Okay.
even Syria.
Okay. That definitely challenges the common narrative.
Right.
It
Now,
does.
this ties into Sowell's argument about how the history of slavery
Yeah.
is frequently used for modern political agendas,
Mm.
even if it means sacrificing accuracy.
Right.
He suggests that understanding the full complexity of history
Mm-hmm.
can help us avoid these pitfalls.
Yeah, I agree with that.
He even brings up Alex Haley,
Okay.
the author of Roots.
Yeah, yeah.
Haley admitted to creating a, quote, myth to live by.
Oh, wow.
It really makes you think about how history can be manipulated,
Right.
sometimes with the best of intentions,
Uh-huh.
but with potentially dangerous consequences.
That raises a crucial point for this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
The importance of being, critical consumers
Yeah.
of information,
Yeah.
especially when we're dealing with sensitive topics.
Right.
History, like many of the issues we're exploring, is rarely black and white.
Right.
It requires us to look beyond simple explanations and be open to different perspectives.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and look at another piece of this puzzle.
All right.
The influence of culture on the economic success of different ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
Sowell is really pushing back against the idea
Okay.
that outcomes are solely determined by race
Uh-huh.
or current circumstances.
Yeah.
He's saying that internal factors like cultural values
You're right.
matter just as much.
So this brings us to a crucial question, and one that I see you grappling with in your notes.
Mm-hmm.
Can the legacy of slavery on its own
Right.
explain the socioeconomic disparities we see today,
Yeah.
or are there other forces at play?
To illustrate this point,
Okay.
Sowell compares the trajectories of two groups with shared ancestry,
Mm-hmm.
African Americans
Right.
and West Indian immigrants,
Okay.
both descended from slaves,
Uh-huh.
but their experiences in America have been vastly different.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Despite facing harsher conditions in the West Indies,
Okay.
West Indian immigrants, on average, have higher incomes, lower unemployment rates,
Right.
and even higher levels of education than African Americans.
Wow.
This difference in outcomes really challenges the idea
Yeah.
that historical disadvantage alone determines success.
So how does Sowell explain this?
Well, he points to the importance of self-reliance.
Okay.
He argues that West Indian slaves developed a culture of independence, growing and selling their own food,
Right.
while American slaves were often trapped in a system of dependence.
Interesting.
This cultural difference, he argues, has had a lasting impact on the economic success of these two groups.
It suggests that cultural values passed down through generations can have a profound impact on a group's economic trajectory.
Yeah.
And it highlights the complexity of factors that contribute to success. It urges us to look beyond simple explanations.
Right.
But Sowell doesn't stop at culture.
Okay.
He brings in geography
Yeah.
and economic circumstances as additional pieces of the puzzle.
He uses the example of the Zar River in Africa.
Okay.
Its many cataracts made it much less useful for trade and transportation
Right.
compared to, say, the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
This example highlights how geography can really impact a region's economic development.
And to drive that point home,
Okay.
Sowell throws out this mind-blowing fact.
All right.
90% of the world's tornadoes occur in the United States.
Oh, wow, that's crazy.
So it seems nature itself has dealt some regions a tougher hand than others.
It certainly underscores the uneven distribution,
Right.
advantages and disadvantages around the world.
Right.
But then Sowell pivots to disparities within the U.S.,
Okay.
specifically focusing on income mobility.
Yeah.
He challenges the notion that
Yeah.
people are stuck in their economic classes.
And he backs this up with a truly surprising statistic.
Okay.
56% of American households
Wow.
will be in the top 10% of income earners
Really?
at some point in their lives.
Hmm.
That completely flips the script on this idea of, like, rigid economic classes.
Duh.
And suggests that economic status is far more fluid than we often think.
Absolutely. It seems like the American dream of upward mobility might have some statistical weight behind it after all.
Okay, so now let's zoom in on a specific case study
Okay.
that highlights how perceptions and identities can shift over time.
Right.
The word redneck.
Interesting.
You've included Huber's A Short History of Rednecks.
Yeah.
And it's quite the journey.
Okay.
This word starts as a derogatory term
Right.
for poor white Southerners in the late 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
often used to justify their exploitation and low wages.
And Huber does a great job of unpacking
Right.
the racial and class dynamics at play here.
Yeah.
He shows how white mill workers sometimes collaborated with factory owners
Wow.
to keep workplaces segregated,
Right.
accepting lower wages in exchange for maintaining a sense of
Yeah.
social and economic superiority over black workers.
It's a stark example of how racial and class consciousness can intertwine and influence economic choices.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
By the late 20th century, white blue-collar workers, particularly in the South,
Right.
start reclaiming rednecks as a positive identity.
Interesting.
It becomes a badge of honor, symbolizing honesty,
Yeah.
hard work, and a rejection of elitism.
It's a fascinating example of how cultural perceptions
Right.
and self-identity can evolve in response to social and economic forces.
Okay.
It shows that even deeply ingrained prejudices
Yeah.
can be challenged and transformed over time.
Okay, so we've explored how slavery wasn't always about race. The influence of culture on economic outcomes,
Right.
the role of geography, the fluid nature of income mobility,
Yeah.
and the evolving identity of the redneck.
Right.
Now it's time to address the big question.
Okay.
Does government intervention always help? Or can it sometimes backfire?
That's where Sowell really challenges conventional wisdom.
Right.
He argues that even the best-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences,
Right.
sometimes exacerbating the very problems they're meant to solve.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
You know, you start off trying to do something good, but without careful consideration.
Right.
You might end up creating a bigger mess.
Exactly.
I see in your notes that you've highlighted Sowell's argument about how government programs
Yeah.
often create perverse incentives.
Uh-huh.
I'm not entirely sure what that means.
So he's talking about how sometimes government programs, while aiming to help,
Right.
can unintentionally reward behaviors
Yeah.
that are ultimately harmful
Mm-hmm.
to individuals and society as a whole.
Got it.
For example, he argues that some welfare programs,
Right.
though intended to alleviate poverty,
Right.
can disincentivize work
Yeah.
and create a culture of dependency,
You could-
leading to a sort of trap rather than a safety net.
So it's not that he's against helping those in need.
Right.
It's more that he questions the effectiveness and sometimes even the unintended harm that can come from certain government programs.
Exactly.
And it's not just welfare programs that he critiques, right?
Not at all.
He also takes aim at things like rent control. He argues that rent control,
Yeah.
while intended to make housing more affordable,
Yeah.
can actually lead to housing shortages
Okay.
and decreased quality
Mm-hmm.
because landlords have less incentive to maintain or improve their properties.
That makes sense.
So in the end, he believes rent control hurts the very people it aims to help.
Yeah, he sees it as a classic example of good intentions gone wrong.
So for Sowell, it's more about empowering people to help themselves
Right.
rather than relying on top-down solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of his perspective.
He seems to have more faith in free markets and individual initiative
Mm-hmm.
than in government intervention.
You've really hit the nail on the head there.
Okay.
He's a strong advocate for creating an environment
Yeah.
where people can succeed through their own efforts
Right.
rather than becoming reliant on government assistance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a major point of contention,
Okay.
as many people strongly believe,
Yeah.
that the government has a moral obligation to provide a safety net for its citizens.
It's a complex debate with valid arguments on both sides.
It is.
I mean, look at programs like Social Security and Medicare.
Mm-hmm.
They've been incredibly beneficial for millions of Americans.
Absolutely.
Those programs demonstrate that government intervention can have positive impacts.
Yeah.
But the question that Sowell raises is, at what point does government assistance become detrimental?
That's a tough one.
And how do we strike that balance between individual responsibility
All right.
and collective action?
Those are tough questions.
It seems like there's no easy answer.
I agree.
These are issues that we as a society need to keep grappling with.
You've perfectly articulated the central dilemma here.
Okay.
Sowell's work doesn't provide simple solutions,
Right.
but it pushes us to think critically
Yeah.
about the role of government
Right.
and to be cautious of quick fixes
Yeah.
that may do more harm than good.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what are the key takeaways that we can apply to your own research? And your initial question about what drives success.
Right.
We've explored a lot of complex and sometimes conflicting ideas.
I think one of the most important lessons
Okay.
is the value of nuanced thinking.
Yeah.
Howell reminds us that these issues are multifaceted.
Right.
And we need to move beyond simplistic explanations.
Yep.
It's not about finding a single answer,
Right.
but rather about considering multiple perspectives
Yep.
and embracing the complexity of the issues.
It's about being critical consumers of information,
Yes.
questioning assumptions, and being open to challenging our own beliefs.
Exactly.
Sowell's work, whether you agree with his conclusions or not,
Mm-hmm.
certainly makes you think differently
Right.
about these important issues.
He encourages us to look at the bigger picture, consider historical context,
Right.
cultural influences,
Yeah.
geographical factors, and the potential pitfalls of government intervention. But it all comes back to individual agency.
Right.
He reminds us that while systemic factors are undeniably at play,
Yeah.
individuals have the power to make choices
Mm-hmm.
and shape their own destinies.
That's a powerful and hopeful message.
It is.
Even amidst all the complex
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes discouraging realities we've explored,
Yeah.
we're not just passive bystanders
Yeah.
in the story of our lives or the story of our society.
Right.
We have a role to play.
This deep dive has taken us on quite a journey.
It has.
We've wrestled with challenging questions, and I hope it's left you
Yeah.
with a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding slavery,
Mm-hmm.
ethnicity,
Yeah.
and economic success.
And perhaps, most importantly, it's left you with more questions to ponder.
Yes,
The quest for knowledge is an ongoing journey.
it is.
Keep exploring,
Uh-huh.
keep questioning,
Mm-hmm.
and keep seeking a deeper understanding of these crucial issues. Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time we were talking about how even well-intentioned government policies can have unexpected consequences. It seems like you're really interested in exploring this idea further.
Yeah, and it's a perfect segue into another one of Sowell's central arguments,
Definitely.
that cultural factors often play a bigger role in shaping group outcomes than government policies.
Interesting.
He really challenges the notion that disparities are solely or even primarily the result of systemic oppression.
So he's asking us to look beyond those simple answers.
Yeah.
And consider a wider range of factors.
Exactly. One of the ways he illustrates this is by comparing the economic performance of Black Americans and West Indian immigrants.
Okay.
Both groups descended from slaves, but with very different trajectories in the U.S.
And this comparison reveals some striking differences. We already touched on how West Indian immigrants tend to have higher incomes and lower unemployment rates than Black Americans, but it goes deeper than that.
Yeah, it does.
They also have higher rates of home ownership and business ownership, and they even attain higher levels of education on average.
That's right.
That's a pretty significant difference, especially considering both groups share a history of slavery. If systemic racism alone were the primary factor determining success, wouldn't we expect to see more similar outcomes?
That's precisely the question Sowell wants us to grapple with.
Okay.
And his answer, as we've seen, points to the influence of culture.
Right.
He suggests that West Indian immigrants brought with them a culture that emphasized self-reliance, hard work, and family stability. These values, he argues, played a crucial role in their economic advancement.
So he's not denying the existence of racism or discrimination.
No.
But he's suggesting that cultural factors can be just as important, or even more so, when it comes to success.
Exactly. He's urging us to consider a broader, more nuanced perspective. And it's important to remember that Sowell himself is Black. He grew up in Harlem during segregation and experienced firsthand the sting of racism. His arguments come from a place of lived experience, which makes them all the more compelling.
It's about understanding the full range of factors at play, rather than attributing everything to a single cause.
Exactly.
Now, I know from your notes that you've also come across some criticisms of Sowell's work.
Oh, yeah.
Some people argue that he downplays the impact of discrimination.
Okay.
And puts too much emphasis on individual responsibility.
That's a valid point.
Right.
Sowell's work has sparked a lot of debate, with some praising his insights and others criticizing his conclusions. Some feel that he oversimplifies complex issues, while others find his emphasis on personal agency to be empowering.
It seems like his work really challenges people to think critically about deeply held beliefs.
It does.
And that can be uncomfortable no matter which side of the argument you're on.
It definitely makes you question assumptions. Right. Now, another point of contention is Sowell's methodology. Some critics argue that he relies too heavily on anecdotal evidence rather than rigorous statistical analysis.
Interesting.
They also suggest that he cherry-picks data to support his pre-existing conclusions.
It's always important to evaluate sources carefully and consider potential biases, especially when dealing with such sensitive topics. We shouldn't shy away from critiquing even the most respected thinkers.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, stepping back for a moment, let's look at another fascinating aspect of Sowell's work.
All right.
His focus on geographical factors.
Right.
We talked about the Zaire River example, but he doesn't stop there.
He also talks about how the distribution of natural resources, climate, and even terrain can impact a society's economic development. For example, he points out that countries with access to coastlines and navigable waterways have a clear advantage in terms of trade and transportation, which can fuel economic growth.
Precisely. And on the flip side, countries that are landlocked or have challenging terrain often face significant obstacles to economic growth.
Makes sense.
It's not about determinism, but these geographical realities certainly play a role.
And he brings up the impact of natural disasters, too. Some regions are just more vulnerable to earthquakes, floods, or droughts, which can set back development for generations. It seems almost like a lottery, in a way.
It highlights the importance of considering these environmental factors when analyzing economic disparities. Now, weaving this back into Sowell's main argument, where does individual initiative fit into this complex web of factors?
It seems like individual initiative is a key theme for Sowell. He's a big believer in the power of hard work and personal responsibility. He even argues that relying too heavily on government assistance can sometimes be detrimental, creating a cycle of dependency.
And he often points to the success of immigrant groups who arrived in America with very little, but achieved remarkable success through sheer determination.
Wow.
It's a powerful message about the potential for individuals to overcome adversity and shape their own destinies.
These immigrant success stories are a recurring theme in Sowell's work.
They are.
And they really resonate with the idea of the American dream. But some argue that he oversimplifies the complexities of poverty and social mobility, ignoring the systemic barriers that make it much harder for some people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
It's a crucial point to consider. Not everyone has the same opportunities. And structural inequalities can create significant obstacles to success.
Acknowledging those structural barriers is essential, even as we celebrate individual achievements.
Now, Sowell is also known for his critique of intellectuals, a rather provocative stance that has stirred up quite a bit of controversy.
He seems to believe that intellectuals, while well-intentioned, often advocate for policies that sound good in theory, but have disastrous consequences in practice.
He argues that they're often detached from the realities of everyday life and prioritize abstract principles over practical solutions.
So like they're living in an ivory tower.
Exactly. He even uses the term vision of the anointed to describe this phenomenon. He suggests that certain groups, often intellectuals, believe they have a superior understanding of how society should function and dismiss the views of ordinary people. He believes this can lead to policies that ignore the needs and experiences of those they're supposed to help.
It's a pretty scathing critique.
It is.
But it does raise some interesting questions about the role of experts in shaping public policy.
It certainly encourages us to think critically about who we trust and why.
Okay.
Now, let's move on to one of Sowell's most controversial arguments, the idea that income inequality isn't inherently a problem. This might be one of the most challenging concepts for people to wrap their heads around.
It definitely goes against the grain of a lot of contemporary thinking.
Yeah, it does.
But Sowell sees income inequality as a natural outcome of a free market economy. He even argues that attempts to redistribute wealth can often do more harm than good.
He believes that wealth isn't a fixed pie.
Okay.
A growing economy, he argues, benefits everyone, even if some people benefit more than others.
Okay.
He points out that many of the wealthiest individuals earned their fortunes by creating businesses and innovations that benefit society as a whole.
So his focus is on expanding the pie rather than just dividing it differently.
Exactly.
And he argues that focusing too much on income inequality distracts from the ultimate goal, economic growth that lifts everyone up.
But of course, not everyone agrees. His critics argue that extreme income inequality can lead to social unrest and undermine democracy. They believe that a society where a tiny elite controls most of the wealth is inherently unjust and requires government intervention to ensure a more equitable distribution of resources.
It's a debate that gets to the very heart of our economic and political systems.
Yeah, it does.
Where do we draw the line between individual responsibility and collective action?
And how do we balance the pursuit of economic growth with the pursuit of social justice? These are tough questions, and there's no easy answer.
Sowell's perspective certainly provides a lot of food for thought.
It does.
But also leaves us with a lot to unpack.
That's the sign of a good deep dive. More questions than answers.
Exactly.
And we're going to continue exploring those questions in the next part. We still need to delve into Sowell's views on race, which are particularly complex and often misunderstood.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the global history of slavery to the intricacies of income inequality, but there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to examine before wrapping up: the limitations of government intervention. This is where Sowell's arguments get really interesting and perhaps a bit controversial.
Yeah, it's an area where he diverges from a lot of conventional thinking. Sowell is deeply skeptical of the government's ability to, solve complex social problems. He argues that government programs often create unintended consequences that can worsen the very issues they're designed to address. He cautions us to remember that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
You start off trying to do something good, but without careful consideration, you might end up creating a bigger mess.
I see in your notes that you've highlighted Sowell's argument about how government programs often create perverse incentives, and I'm not entirely sure what that means. So he's talking about how sometimes government programs, while aiming to help, can unintentionally reward behaviors that are ultimately harmful to individuals and society as a whole.
Okay.
For example, he argues that some welfare programs,
Right.
though intended to alleviate poverty, can disincentivize work and create a culture of dependency, leading to a sort of a trap rather than a safety net.
So it's not that he's against helping those in need.
Yeah.
It's more that he questions the effectiveness and sometimes even the unintended harm that can come from certain government programs. And it's not just welfare programs that he critiques, right?
No.
He also takes aim at things like rent control.
Exactly.
He argues that rent control, while intended to make housing more affordable, actually leads to housing shortages and decreased quality because landlords have less incentive to maintain or improve their properties.
Right.
So in the end, he believes rent control hurts the very people it aims to help.
Yeah, he sees it as a classic example of good intentions gone wrong.
So for Sowell, it's more about empowering people to help themselves rather than relying on top-down solutions. He seems to have more faith in free markets and individual initiative than in government intervention.
I think that's a good summary of his perspective. He's a strong advocate for creating an environment where people can succeed through their own efforts rather than becoming reliant on government assistance. Now, this is a major point of contention, as many people strongly believe that the government has a moral obligation to provide a safety net for its citizens.
It's a complex debate with valid arguments on both sides. I mean, look at programs like Social Security and Medicare. They've been incredibly beneficial for millions of Americans.
Absolutely. Those programs demonstrate that government intervention can have positive impacts. But the question that Sowell raises is, at what point does government assistance become detrimental? And how do we strike that balance between individual responsibility and collective action?
And how do we ensure that government programs are truly effective without creating those unintended consequences that he talks about?
Yeah.
It seems like there's no easy answer. These are tough issues that we as a society need to keep grappling with.
You've perfectly articulated the central dilemma here. So Wells' work doesn't provide simple solutions, but it pushes us to think critically about the role of government and to be cautious of quick fixes that may do more harm than good.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways we can apply to your own research and your initial question about what drives success? We've explored a lot of complex and sometimes conflicting ideas.
I think one of the most important lessons is the value of nuanced thinking. Sowell reminds us that these issues are multifaceted, and we need to move beyond simplistic explanations. It's not about finding a single answer, but rather about considering multiple perspectives and embracing the complexity of the issues.
It's about being critical consumers of information, questioning assumptions, and being open to challenging our own beliefs. Sowell's work, whether you agree with his conclusions or not, certainly makes you think differently about these important issues.
He encourages us to look at the bigger picture, consider historical context, cultural influences, geographical factors, and the potential pitfalls of government intervention. But it all comes back to individual agency. He reminds us that while systemic factors are undeniably at play, individuals have the power to make choices and shape their own destinies.
That's a powerful and hopeful message, even amidst all the complex and sometimes discouraging realities we've explored. We're not just passive bystanders in the story of our lives or the story of our society. We have a role to play.
This deep dive has taken us on quite a journey. We've wrestled with challenging questions, and I hope it's left you with a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding slavery, ethnicity, and economic success.
And perhaps, most importantly, it's left you with more questions to ponder. The quest for knowledge is an ongoing journey. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking a deeper understanding of these crucial issues.